Melvin was bullied relentlessly. At times, it felt like the almost comical youth ultraviolence seen in the books of King and Burgess. The older kids would throw rocks at him, yank his hair, drag him around by his unfortunately large ears, and throw him into the mud bank on the edge of the football field. Not too long ago, they set fire to his locker. I never knew who exactly did it, but that was the rumor I heard while waiting in the fire assembly out in the rain. Melvin was an easy target. He was thoroughly overweight, had pasty skin the color of bacon fat, and smelled of something I don't care to mention. His nose looked like an invisible hand was pulling his nostrils firmly upwards, and his hair was a shade of bistre with the texture of wet straw. He should be wearing glasses, but they'd only ever last a day and Medicaid can only go so far. The worst bit was that he didn't have the smarts to make up for it. It wasn't like he was some quiet academic who will eventually one-up his bullies, not through violence but through success. In class, he was a failure. It wasn't all his fault though. Our school was pathetically underfunded, and Melvin had no way of getting the extra help he needed. He lived on the other side of the tracks, a caravan park on the edge of town that my mother warned me never to go near. I didn't know much about his home life until it was all over the news. Melvin did have one thing he excelled in though. When I was younger, around 5 or 6, I was actually good friends with him. That was before it became common law not to be associated with him. Any time I spent with him, he'd shower me in bug facts. Even now, whenever he had a moment of solace at school, he'd spend it crouched in the corner of the yard, digging through the earth with his rusted fork. Any insects he found, he'd store away in a little plastic bag he brought everywhere with him. He would fill that bag with just about any small creature he got his hands on. Then, when it was almost full, he'd seal it and turn its contents into a fine mush with a rock. For the rest of the week, you'd never see him without that bag. That is, until someone inevitably took it from him and he had to begin the process all over again. Now, nobody liked Melvin. I didn't either. Not that I felt the need to violently show it. If you had told me last year that I'd end up spending my summer hanging out with him, I probably would have spat on you. It started with a little girl's bike. Me and my friends were dicking around in my cul-de-sac when Chet, the anthropomorphic glue that kept our friend group together, decided it would be funny to steal the bicycle of my neighbor's 5-year-old daughter. We egged him on and he went through with it, and spent the rest of the day riding around on it. By the evening, he'd gotten tired of it and dumped it on the edge of the creek. As soon as I returned home, my mother confronted me about it. Apparently, that little girl spent the entire day bawling her eyes out in the middle of the street. Admittedly, I snitched immediately. Chet ended up being fined an amount he never told us. After it came out that I was the one who grassed, I was persona non grata. Within the week, I knew what it was like to be Melvin. I spent yard time standing on my own lamenting. Still, I never tried to find a friend in Melvin. Thought I wouldn't have to stoop that low. This all carried on until the summer, and beyond. By mid-June, social solitary confinement was getting to me. I thought long and hard about extending an olive branch to Melvin, but always decided against it. Eventually, my mind was made up for me. One morning, my mother woke me up around noon and told me that there was a friend waiting for me at the door. I leapt out of bed hoping it was someone from my old posse, maybe even Chet coming to make up. Instead, I found Melvin awkwardly standing on my front porch. "What do you want?" I launched into an interrogation. "I was wondering if you'd come play with me today," he told me in his low, nasally voice. After a minute of internal debate, I thought, screw it. I shouted to my mom that I'll be back before dinner and left to spend the day with Melvin. Our first conversation together felt like dialogue from one of those crummy How to Make Friends books. He attempted some polite icebreakers, told a few bad jokes, and offered me a piece of apple-flavored chewing gum. I declined since the packet had a bit of a stain on it. Before long, our interactions began to resemble normal. We made our way down to the creek, chatting and hitting things with sticks. Melvin is an interesting guy once you get to know him. Apparently, he did live in the trailer park, but not in a trailer. His stepdad was the landlord, and they lived in a large house at the head of the grounds. His mother worked long hours at some place or another, and Melvin spent a lot of time home alone. As we were talking and traversing our way over a moss-covered log, Melvin suddenly squealed with delight and pointed at something I couldn't see. He jumped from the felled tree and dropped to his knees, scrounging around in the mud. I crouched next to him and watched in awe as he pulled out the largest, thickest grub I'd ever seen out from under a leaf. "Whoa, man, that's disgusting." "Cool," I yelled. Melvin held the grub uncomfortably close to his lips as he gazed longingly at it. Eventually, he snapped out of the trance and, with his free hand, rummaged around in a fanny pack. He pulled out a plastic Ziploc bag filled with a rancid paste of crushed invertebrates. He opened it with his teeth and gently placed the grub inside of it. He zipped it up again and stuffed it back inside of his pack. "Why do you do that?" I asked him bluntly. "Do what?" Melvin replied. "You know," I answered, "that thing you always do with the plastic bags and the insects." Melvin shrugged earnestly, and that was the last we talked on that subject. This became my summer routine. Almost every other day I'd spend hours hanging out with Melvin, usually down at the creek. I made sure as best I could to not be seen by any of my old friends. If it came out that I was spending my time with Melvin, any last hopes I had of clawing back my popularity were done for. On this particular day in July, me and Mel were walking to our usual spot. I peeped over the brow of a small yet steep hill just before he did. I quickly dropped to the ground when I saw Chet and a few others on the other side, making their way towards us. I scurried backwards and pathetically took off running, past Melvin and across to the other side of the clearing. Panting, I glanced from behind the tree I was using as my hiding place. I watched Chet and the gang lock eyes with Melvin as he climbed down from the slope. Before he could run like me, they pounced on him. I carried on watching, and they buried his face into the mud, stamping on his hand and pinching his neck. I turned around and walked back home. I didn't see Melvin for a few days after that. When he did finally turn up at my door again, he had a black eye and a swollen lip. I stupidly asked him, "Are you okay?" and left it at that. I didn't bother apologizing. I didn't think there was anything to say sorry for at the time. It was that day he suggested we should hang out at his house. I was reluctant, but seeing the state he was in, I understood his reasoning. Despite my mother's warning, I followed Melvin to the trailer park. It was as run down as I imagined. Bits of scrap metal and old cars were strewn across the front lawns of the caravans. From old wire hung wet clothes that dripped a slow rain onto the already sodden earth underneath. I would have believed you if you told me the place was abandoned. Melvin's house emerged further down the trail. It was an infancy bungalow, although it at least had a fresh lick of paint. Tacked onto the side of it was a small reception. Melvin informed me both of his parents were working. His father owned the source of the low rent, that being the dump next to the trailer park. He admitted that he didn't know where his mother worked, but that she was out all day most days. The first thing I noticed was the dust. Every surface in his house was covered in a thin skin of dust and cobwebs. The place smelled strange, I honestly couldn't think of a better adjective for it. The wallpaper was completely mismatched, and when I looked more closely at the dozens of pictures hanging up, I realized that each of them seemed to display a different family. I was too preoccupied during the rest of our time together to ask him about it. We had drinks and snacks, of which he seemed to have an endless supply of both. We realized that we both were big fans of the same trading card game, so a few hours of that scorching hot day were spent in his room playing it. He had some pretty rare, expensive cards in his collection, and every time his back was turned, I made sure to pocket one. Melvin's room was a mess. It stank of piss and the corners were decorated with black mold. Clothes were everywhere, as were roaches. If one ever scuttled in front of him, he'd crush it with his fist and smear the mooshed remains against his trouser legs to clean it from his hand. It was around this point I decided that spending the summer on my own wasn't all that bad. After we'd finished up with all the activities he could strain out of my visit, I excused myself to go home. "Wait!" he shouted, grabbing my wrist as I walked outside. "What?" I said through gritted teeth as I tried to politely pull myself free from his grasp. "There's something I really wanted to show you," he snorted. "I can't believe I haven't brought my best friend to see it yet." I sighed. "What do you want to show me, Melvin?" "My maggot farm," he said and began to lead me to it. The heat outside was much more bearable than it had been earlier, but still thoroughly uncomfortable. Melvin ignored the rest of my questions, instead opting to silently drag. We ended up at the far corner of the trailer park. There was a few yards of lame forest cover between the edge of the trailer park and the corrugated iron fencing of his dad's dump yard. A portion of the rusted fence had collapsed, and on top of it was an old white water tank, as well as a myriad of other smaller pieces of trash. The tank was around 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, not including the lid. I stood back and watched Melvin struggle to push the immense metal lid off the top of the tank. I chuckled to myself and looked around. I only now realized how secluded we were. Before I could ask Melvin if he wanted any help, the lid fell back enough to release the foulest smelling odor I've ever known, before or since. It made me physically recoil and gag. I quickly covered my mouth and nose with my baseball cap. "What the actual hell, Melvin?" I said, muffled by the fabric. "It's my maggot farm," Melvin told me. "I've been working on it for some time now. I collect roadkill a lot. I leave them to fester in this drum, and after a while it becomes filled with maggots. Come have a closer look." I stared in pure shock at Melvin. He looked like a prideful child, finally getting to share his glittery art piece with his parents. When I didn't immediately take a peek at it, he spoke again, more forcefully this time. I said, "Come take a look." Reluctantly, I took 2 steps forward and glanced quickly over the metal rim, intent on getting it over with. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had to look again, longer this time, to make sure. The tank was full of rotting meat. Intestines and bits of fur and bone fragments added an extra texture to the rancid soup. A bizarre yellow, oily liquid pooled around the flesh. Worst of all, it was infested with countless maggots. The tiny white stubs squirmed in their viscous home. Clusters of holes gave way to more and more eggs, ready to hatch a new generation of maggots. Eventually, they'd become flies and start the process all over again. "Melvin, that has got to be the most disgusting thing I've..." Before I could finish, Melvin swung a discarded tire iron into the back of my head. My world turned to nothing and I crumpled to the ground. I woke up an unknowable amount of time later. It could have been hours, more likely a few minutes. It was pitch black, total, absolute darkness. I took a deep breath in and instantly knew where I was. I tried to stand up, but my head hit the inside of the lid. I slipped in the swirling stew of rot which rose up above my waist and fell. Some of it went in my mouth. I gagged and threw up, adding my vomit to the concoction. The smell was so foul it burned away the hairs in my nostrils. I began to feel the minuscule, tearing bites of the maggots. It was like a swarm of gnats. I writhed around, imagining my unseen attackers burrowing into my skin and laying eggs. My head still hurt like hell. It took me a while to realize what had happened. In my state of panic, the first thing I checked were the cards in my back pocket. I figured they'd be ruined now, stained and soaking beyond any recognition. I felt for them, but they weren't there. I started to bang on the steel walls of my prison, screaming and hoping that someone would hear me. No one did. My foot brushed against a firm hunk of meat somewhere on the far side of the tank, and I recoiled, making myself as small as possible, curling up into a fetal ball of fear. I'd never been more afraid in my life. My cousin told me about sniffing glue, and not that long ago I tried it for myself. The gases coming from the rot had a similar effect. I could feel my brain cells dying. Eventually, I was able to form a cognitive thought. That was that I should try to chip away at the patches of rust that lined the inside of the tank. I felt around directly in front of me for something that could be used as a tool. I imagined I'd find a sturdy piece of bone, but I found something far different. It had a metallic center and two rigid strips of fabric attached to either side. It was a watch. I held it up and felt around in the darkness for the buttons. I pressed one and all it did was beep. I'm sure that had some effect, but nothing of use. I pressed another one and likewise all it did was beep. The third, however, triggered the small digital display light. In the brief second of vision it caused, I saw that there was someone else in here with me. I froze. My constant state of thrashing, caused by the maggots penetrating my skin, stopped. With a shaking hand, I pressed the LED on again, holding it down this time. Sitting across from me was Melvin. He was naked, or at the very least didn't have a shirt on. He was watching me with content eyes. He smiled when he knew that I'd seen him. I realized that the piece of meat my foot brushed against minutes before was his leg. Melv. I was a mess. I struggled to form basic thoughts, let alone a challenging question. What the hell was all I managed to spit out. Melvin giggled to himself but said nothing. Instead, he went back to picking maggots out from their bloody nest and stuffing them in his mouth. I began to gag and heave again. There was physically nothing left in me to throw up, so instead my vomit was composed of stomach acid and bile. Once I was finished spilling my guts, I remembered the plan. I shoved the watch into my pocket, not wanting to have to look at Melvin anymore. I felt around in the sludge, and almost immediately found what I was looking for. It was a chunk of jagged jawbone from the skull of a deer or large dog. I turned and started to scrape it against a patch of brittle rust. Gradually, I felt layers of oxidized metal flakes peel off. Finally, with a powerful stab, I pushed the bone straight through it. A small, olive-sized hole let in the first ray of natural light in what felt like forever. I quickly pressed my mouth against the hole, accidentally breathing in tiny shards of rust as I gasped for fresh air. While I pressed my body against the walls of the drum, I felt something below me. I couldn't reach with my hand, but my shin brushed against yet another patch of rust. It was right at the base where a bad welding job attached the two main parts of the water tank. With my mouth still clasped around freedom, I kicked violently at the fragmenting barrier. Moving my legs was like trying to run in a vat of molasses. Again and again and again I kicked at it until finally my foot broke through. I was filled with hope and stamped at the loose debris, trying desperately to create an opening large enough for me to squeeze through. The fetid liquid oozed out as the gaping wound in the side of the tank grew wide enough for a 12-year-old to pull himself through. "Hey, hey!" Melvin roared from right behind me. I ignored him and took a deep breath from the smaller of the two holes. I pinched my nose, closed my eyes, and plunged beneath the rotting surface. I left my baseball cap behind me as I felt around for my exit. I grabbed the rim, cutting my hand on the sharp edges. I yanked myself down and finally out. Like a newborn, my head covered in filth erupted from the steel womb. It was followed by my two arms, which grabbed onto the grass in front of me. I began pulling myself out. My forward motion stopped at my waist. I was stuck fast, tearing clumps of grass from the sodden earth as I tried desperately to free myself. Suddenly, I felt someone grab my foot. Melvin was trying to drag me back in. I screamed and planted my hand on either side of the entrance, painfully pushing myself forward. I kicked back, struggling against his vice-like grip. Finally, the sole of my shoe made contact with his jaw. The momentum of the strike propelled me from the drum and sent me tumbling out onto the rot-soaked ground. As soon as I was free, I bolted. I staggered to my feet and ran as fast as my weary body could manage. I plodded through the tangled foliage, narrowly avoiding a discarded washing machine. I didn't look back as I streaked past the trailers, their occupants watching me in confusion and disgust. I cut through the creek, not wanting anyone to see me in this state. I emerged near my house and walked the last few yards exhausted. This took place in the summer of 1995 and was a pivotal moment in my life. I go to therapy often, not only because of the events of that day, but it does tend to come up in almost every session. My mother was so disturbed by what happened to me, she rang the police. A cop turned up at my house to talk to. He was trying to figure out exactly what had happened. Once I spewed my account and he finished his coffee, he thanked us and turned to leave. Just before he did, he spotted the digital watch in the kitchen bin. It was the one that had been in my pocket since the incident, the one my mother threw away along with my ruined clothes. He turned white when he saw it. He grabbed some tissue paper and wrapped his hand in it, picking up the filth-covered watch which had, to the cop, an oddly familiar gecko pattern on the straps. "Where did you find this?" he said in a low, worrying voice. I told him that it was the watch I mentioned in my account, the one I found in the maggot farm. My parents never told me what happened next. It was to protect me, I suppose. A day later, it was plastered all over the local news that a small business owner and dedicated family man who I realized was Melvin's dad had been arrested. Anytime it was mentioned, my mother would quickly turn the channel over. As far as I could remember, I never saw Melvin again. He stopped showing up to school, and the prevailing theory was that he'd been made to live with his aunt the state over. Not that I could talk to any about it, as in Melvin's absence I became the new punching bag for anyone with a broken home life for the rest of middle school. I'm 42 now and have kids of my own, a boy and a girl aged 6 and 8. I moved away from my hometown long ago, and now live a quaint, happy life. Recently, my brother visited and told me about a Facebook group he recently joined that was dedicated to my old school. Yesterday evening, I sat down with my kids to show them what I had to put up with, and to get a nice dose of nostalgia. The most recent post was about a boy I didn't recognize, but soon remembered was the younger brother of my old friend Simon. A few days ago was the 30th anniversary of his disappearance. The comments were filled with outpourings of sympathy and reminiscing. I looked at the photo and then at my son. As a parent, hearing about these sorts of stories really strikes a nerve. I studied the boy in the picture while my children fired a barrage of questions at me. His sweet grin and rosy cheeks brought a tear to my eye as I mentally put myself in the position of his grieving parents all those years ago. I wonder what my children were thinking as they watched me drop the phone, then fall to my knees, wailing and crying into my hands. After all, they didn't notice the watch the boy in the photo was wearing, nor did they know the significance of the gecko pattern straps.